What most people misunderstand about empaths is that their greatest power was never their kindness. It was their restraint. For years, the empath plays a role the world assigns them. They absorb pain, they translate other people's chaos into calm, they feel the room before they even walk into it. And because they're wired this way, because feeling deeply is as natural to them as breathing, people around them learn something very quickly: this person will always come back. They will always forgive. They will always find a reason to stay. And the narcissist doesn't create victims. They find people who were already trained to endure, people who were taught long before any relationship that love means suffering quietly, that loyalty means tolerating what should never be tolerated. So the cycle runs. The empath gives. The narcissist takes. The world watches and calls the empath too sensitive, calls the narcissist confident. And everybody loses, except the person doing the taking. But here's what nobody talks about. Here's the part that gets buried under every article about narcissistic abuse and healing crystals and cutting toxic people off. There is a point, a specific, silent, unremarkable moment when an empath decides they are done, not angry, not dramatic, not posting about it, just done. And when that switch flips, something inside them doesn't break. It clarifies. Every tool they spend a lifetime developing to understand people, to read rooms, to anticipate needs, to see beneath the surface of behavior. Those tools don't disappear. They just change hands. The empath stops using their intelligence to protect the people who hurt them and starts using it to protect themselves. That is not a wounded person. That is not a victim recovering. That is the most psychologically precise, emotionally calibrated, strategically aware human being you will ever encounter. And they are no longer playing defense. The narcissist was never the most dangerous person in the room. They were just the loudest, the fed-up empath. They're the one who spent years studying the loudest person in the room, and they never forgot a single thing they learned. Most empaths don't start out sensitive. They start out smart. As children, they learned something that other kids didn't have to learn, that the emotional temperature of the room determined their safety. If mom was tense, you stayed quiet. If dad was unpredictable, you watched his face before you watched anything else. You learned to read micro-expressions before you even knew what they were. You learned that if you could feel what someone needed before they asked for it, you could avoid the storm. You could keep the peace. You could make things okay. That's not sensitivity. That's survival intelligence, developed early, reinforced daily, rewarded every time it worked. And here is where it gets painful, because that same skill that kept you safe as a child becomes the exact mechanism that makes you a target as an adult. You walk into a room and you feel people. You sense when someone is hurting beneath their anger. You see the wound behind the behavior. Most people look at a difficult person and see a threat. You look at the same person and see someone who needs something. And because you were built to respond to need, because your entire nervous system was wired to detect it and move toward it, you do what you always do. You stay. You try, you believe. The narcissist doesn't place an advertisement. They don't announce themselves. What they do is present exactly the kind of pain that an empath cannot walk away from. They show just enough vulnerability to activate your instinct to help, just enough chaos to make you feel needed, just enough warmth to make you believe that if you give a little more, try a little harder, love a little better, something will finally shift. It never shifts because it was never broken the way you thought it was. But you keep trying, not because you're weak, not because you're foolish, but because you are doing exactly what you were built to do. You are using the most sophisticated emotional operating system a human being can develop, and you are pointing it at someone who learned long ago how to exploit precisely that system. This is why the empath stays longer than anyone else. This is why they forgive more than anyone else. This is why they are the last to leave and the first to blame themselves when it all falls apart. Because everything about their psychology was shaped around one core belief, that if you understand someone deeply enough, you can help them. That love, when given fully and patiently, is always enough, and nobody ever told them that some people don't want to be understood. Some people want to be served. That distinction, that one quiet, devastating distinction, is what costs the empath years, sometimes decades. It costs them relationships, health, identity, and the kind of self-trust that once lost takes tremendous work to rebuild. But here is what that cost quietly builds inside them. A knowledge so deep, so personal, so hard-won that no classroom could ever teach it. They now know exactly how darkness operates, because they lived inside it long enough to memorize every room. You don't see it coming. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moment an empath finally breaks. There's no explosion, no dramatic confrontation, no slamming doors or final speeches. From the outside, it looks like an ordinary Tuesday. From the inside, it feels like a continent shifting beneath the ocean, silent, massive, and permanent. Something just stops. Not the love necessarily, not even the pain. What stops is the trying. That relentless, exhausting, deeply personal effort to fix what was never yours to fix. To understand what was designed specifically to stay misunderstood. To reach someone who was never actually reaching back. Just extending their arm far enough to keep you leaning forward. And when that stops, something remarkable happens inside the empath's mind. The noise clears, not gradually, suddenly, like a frequency that's been buzzing in the background for so long you stopped hearing it, and then one day it cuts out, and the silence is so loud it almost hurts. Psychologists sometimes call this the detachment threshold. The point where the emotional cost of staying finally outweighs the emotional programming that demanded you do. But that clinical language doesn't capture what it actually feels like from the inside. It doesn't capture the strange, unfamiliar calm that settles in. The way your own thoughts start to sound like yours again. The way you look at the situation that consumed you and suddenly see it with devastating clarity. Not through the eyes of someone trying to save it, but through the eyes of someone who is simply done. This is the shift that nobody around the empath recognizes, because the empath doesn't announce it. They've spent years being told their feelings are too much, so they've become experts at keeping the most important ones completely invisible. They go quiet. They become pleasant, even. They smile at the right moments. They say the right things. And the people around them, especially the narcissist, interpret that quiet as compliance, as retreat, as the empath finally learning their place. That is the most dangerous misread a person can make. Because what looks like surrender from the outside is actually reorganization on the inside. The empath is not shrinking. They are consolidating. Every resource they spent bleeding outward. Their attention, their emotional energy, their extraordinary ability to understand human behavior. All of it is quietly, methodically being redirected inward, back to themselves, back toward their own clarity, their own healing, their own next move. The empath has not given up. They have simply stopped spending themselves on someone who was never going to give anything back. And that decision, that quiet, invisible, irreversible decision, is not the end of their story. It is the moment their story finally begins to belong to them again. People talk about emotional intelligence like it's a personality trait. Something soft, something that makes you better at birthday cards and listening to friends cry. What they don't understand is that real emotional intelligence, the kind built through years of surviving unpredictable people, is not soft at all. It is precision. The empath spent years inside a dynamic that most people will never fully understand from the outside. And during those years, while they were absorbing, forgiving, adjusting, and trying, they were also watching. Constantly, involuntarily, their nervous system was running a continuous analysis of every shift in tone, every change in energy, every pattern of behavior that preceded pain. They weren't doing it consciously. They were doing it the way a soldier learns to read terrain, because their survival depended on it. That doesn't disappear when they walk away. Every pattern they identified, every manipulation tactic they learned to recognize, every moment they noticed how a certain behavior was deployed to create confusion, to manufacture guilt, to keep them questioning their own perception. All of that knowledge is still there, organized, cataloged, quietly waiting. And here is what changes when the empath finally decides to protect themselves instead of their abuser. They stop using that knowledge to anticipate attacks and start using it to recognize them instantly. They stop reading the room to keep someone else comfortable and start reading it to keep themselves safe. The same radar that made them endlessly vulnerable becomes, in the hands of a decided empath, one of the most sophisticated defense systems a human being can possess. You cannot manipulate someone who has already mapped every manipulation. You cannot gaslight someone who has documented their own reality with the quiet obsessiveness of someone who spent years being told not to trust it. You cannot destabilize someone who has already survived the worst version of what you're offering and came out the other side knowing exactly what it was. This is why the fed-up empath is so fundamentally different from someone who simply got angry and left. Anger fades, clarity doesn't. The empath didn't just leave a situation, they graduated from it. They earned a level of understanding about human behavior, about dark psychology, about the mechanics of emotional manipulation that most people will spend their entire lives never acquiring. And they didn't learn it from a book. They learned it from living inside it, from feeling every layer of it against their own skin. That kind of knowledge doesn't make you bitter. It doesn't make you paranoid. When it's processed correctly, when the empath does the work of understanding what happened to them and why, it makes you untouchable. Not cold, not closed. Not hardened beyond recognition. Just finally, completely, and permanently, wise enough to never be that available to darkness again. Everyone assumes the narcissist is the chess player in the room, the strategist, the one who sees the board while everyone else just sees the pieces. And for a long time, inside the relationship with an empath, that assumption holds up. The narcissist moves. The empath reacts. The narcissist creates confusion. The empath works to resolve it. The narcissist withdraws. The empath pursues. It looks from the outside like total domination of one mind over another. But that picture is missing something critical. The narcissist was never actually seeing the empath. They were seeing a function, a source, a reliable emotional supply that could be triggered, managed, and reset with the right combination of warmth and withdrawal. They didn't study the empath the way the empath studied them. They didn't need to. When you found something that works, you don't question the mechanism, you just keep pulling the lever. That is their fundamental blindness, and it runs deeper than arrogance. The narcissist operates from a fixed playbook. The tactics change on the surface. The silent treatment, the love bombing, the blame shifting, the manufactured crisis, but the underlying structure never evolves. It doesn't need to, because it was built for a specific target, someone still trying, someone still hoping, someone whose empathy keeps them one step behind their own instincts. The moment the empath stops trying, that entire playbook becomes obsolete. And the narcissist doesn't realize it immediately. Because the empath, as we already know, doesn't announce the shift. They go quiet. They become steady. And the narcissist, reading that steadiness through their own framework, interprets it as an opportunity. They believe the empath has finally been broken into full compliance. They believe the resistance is gone. So they push further. They try the same levers with more force. They escalate the tactics that used to work because they have no other tools. And for the first time, nothing lands. The guilt doesn't stick. The confusion doesn't take hold. The empath looks at the move being made and recognizes it not as something painful and personal, but as something predictable and hollow. That moment, that specific moment when the narcissist realizes the empath is no longer reachable, is the moment the entire dynamic collapses. And the narcissist has no framework for it. Their identity is built around the certainty that people can always be pulled back, that the right pressure applied to the right wound will always produce the desired response. But you cannot find a wound in someone who has finally finished bleeding. The narcissist spent the entire relationship believing they were the dangerous one, believing their control was the power in the room. What they never understood, what their own psychology made it impossible for them to understand, is that they were never controlling the empath. They were only ever controlling the empath's hope. And the day that hope ran out, they didn't gain power. They lost the only leverage they ever actually had. We have a story we tell about dangerous people. We make them loud. We make them aggressive. We give them sharp edges and cold eyes and a presence that fills the room with unease. We've been conditioned by movies, by culture, by every cautionary tale we were ever told, to believe that the most powerful person in any situation is the one who takes up the most space. That story is wrong, and believing it is exactly what makes people vulnerable to the ones who are actually dangerous. Real psychological power was never loud. It was never performed. It never needed an audience or a reaction or the confirmation of someone else's fear to know that it existed. Real power is the kind that sits completely still in a room full of chaos and feels no pull toward any of it. The kind that sees every move being made, understands every motivation behind it, and chooses, deliberately, consciously chooses how to respond, or whether to respond at all. That is not the narcissist. The narcissist needs the room to feel them. They need eyes on them, reactions from them, energy directed toward them, positive or negative, it barely matters. Attention is the oxygen their identity runs on. Remove it and watch how quickly the composure fractures. Watch how rapidly the careful architecture of their persona develops cracks. The narcissist's power was always conditional, always dependent on an audience that was still engaged. The empath who has done the work asks for none of that. They don't need to be felt in the room. They don't need you unsettled or watching or afraid. What they have is something far more durable than any performance of power could ever produce. They have self-knowledge so deep it cannot be manipulated. They have emotional literacy so advanced that they can read the architecture of a person's behavior within minutes of meeting them. They have lived experience of the darkest corners of human psychology, not studied from a distance, but navigated from the inside. And they carry all of that completely quietly. This is what the world consistently misreads about sensitivity. Sensitivity was never weakness dressed up in better language. Sensitivity is data collection at a level most human beings never access. Every feeling the empath processed, every pain they sat inside long enough to understand, every moment they looked at someone who was hurting them and asked why instead of just how do I escape, all of that built something inside them that cannot be replicated by someone who never had to survive their own depth. We spend so much time warning people about the narcissist, teaching people to spot them, name them, categorize their behaviors, and defend against their tactics. And that knowledge matters. It genuinely matters. But we never talk about what happens when the person they targeted finally understands themselves completely. We never talk about what is built inside a human being who walked through that kind of fire and came out the other side, not hardened, not broken, not bitter, but clear. The quietest person in the room is not always the safest person in the room. And the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who feels everything is give them enough time, enough pain, and enough silence to finally understand exactly who they are. Because once an empath knows themselves that completely, there is nothing left in you to use against them. And that is not a warning, that is a fact.